not threatened by the idea of self-determination by Native Hawaiians. In 1978, Hawaii convened a constitutional convention that was designed in part to right some of the wrongs done to Native Hawaiians by proposing changes to our state constitution. The Constitutional Convention created the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, or OHA. Constitutional Convention created the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, or OHA, so that Native Hawaiians would have some ability to manage their own affairs on behalf of Native Hawaiians. So that Native Hawaiians would have some ability to manage their own affairs on behalf of Native Hawaiians. The people of Hawaii ratified the creation of OHA in our state constitution and voted to allow the trustees of OHA to be elected solely by Native Hawaiians. The provisions relating to the election of OHA trustees was challenged in Rice v. Cayetano all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which heard the case in 1999. I attended the hearing at the Supreme Court while I was serving as Hawaii's Lieutenant Governor, and the court ruled that the state of Hawaii could not limit the right to vote in a state election to Native Hawaiians. This decision does not stand for the proposition that Native Hawaiians are non-indigenous people. I also attended the more recent hearing involving OHA, and again, that hearing before our United States Supreme Court raised other issues. The issue was not whether Native Hawaiians are indigenous people. I was in the Hawaii State Legislature when we approved creation of Hawaiian language immersion schools, recognizing that language is an integral part of a culture and people. Public Hawaiian language preschools called Punana Leo were started in 1984. We now have Hawaiian language elementary, middle, and high schools in Hawaii, and a new generation of fluent Hawaiian language speakers are helping to keep this beautiful and culturally important language alive. Other Native peoples are looking to Hawaii as a model, as a means of preserving and perpetuating their native languages. I believe how we treat our Native indigenous people reflects our values and who we are as a country. Clearly, there is much in the history of our interactions with the Native peoples of what is now the United States that makes us less than proud. But one of the great attributes of America has always been our ability to look objectively at our history, to learn from it, and when possible, to make amends. H.R. 2314 is supported by the great majority of Hawaii's residents, by its Republican governor, by our state legislature, and by dozens of organizations. In 2007, the U.S. House of Representatives passed H.R. 505, an earlier version of this bill, by a vote of 261 to 153. This was the second time that the House had recognized the need for Native Hawaiian self-determination. The State of Hawaii motto, which was also the motto of the Kingdom of Hawaii, is Uamau Ke'ea o Ka'aina I Kapono, which translates to the life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. Native Hawaiians, like American Indians and Alaska Natives, have an inherent sovereignty based on their status as indigenous Native people. I urge your support of H.R. 2314. Mahalo nui loa, aloha, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Maisie. Ranking member? Members on my left or right?
Chairman, I want to associate myself with the most eloquent statement presented by Ms. Havrona before our committee, and I want to say absolutely I join her and commend her and support everything that she has said concerning this bill. Thank you, Maisie. Appreciate it. Mahalo.
Gentleman from Hawaii. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at the testimony of Ms. Harriet, who's a commissioner of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Have you had the opportunity?
I did briefly read the testimony.
Yeah. In that, without going in any great length at it this time, among other things that are cited in there is the Admissions Act of 1959, when Hawaii became a state. The contention here in this testimony, one of the contentions is that this bill that you and I are supporting now is racially based. Could you elaborate on that in terms of why we think this is not the case? when we come down to it, when you get right down to the nitty-gritties of all of this, this has nothing to do with the Constitution. This has nothing to do with race. This has to do with assets, land and money. Land and money. This has to do with assets, land and money.
There is an entire line of other cases all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court that talks about the special relationship that the United States has with indigenous people, the Native Americans and the Alaska Natives. So the Native Hawaiians are an indigenous people. There is a whole line of cases, that, as I mentioned, and there is, yes, a line of cases relating to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. This is not an equal protection issue. I think this is where the crux of the difference is, that this is not a race-based legislation. It is based on the acknowledgement that Native Hawaiians are an indigenous people, and it is those line of cases that apply, not the line of cases that relate to equal protection.
Is it not one of the elements of the Admissions Act, which is cited in this testimony, that, and I quote, one of the 5 purposes was, quoting within that testimony, for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians as defined in the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act 1920 as amended.
That's correct.
And were we not both in the legislature when we developed what we hoped was going to be the definitive way of handling this situation when we put the Office of Hawaiian Affairs together?
Well, I was not in the legislature until 1980. Clearly, I supported the 1978 Constitutional Convention, which proposed the creation of OHA, which was ratified by the majority of the people of Hawaii. And yes, we have attempted, when I was in the legislature for 14 years, to implement the provisions of the creation of OHA.
So the land that's referred to there, again in this testimony, talks about ceded land. Could you elaborate for a moment as to what the word ceded, or what the phrase ceded land means in the context of Hawaiian history?
Well, I know that there is a legal definition regarding ceded lands, but it represents lands that were held by the federal government when Hawaii became a republic, or an act. So there is the state constitution also requires that certain amounts of revenues from ceded lands should go to Native Hawaiians, and that is an issue that is still being debated and addressed in Hawaii.
The lands, the ceded lands, are held in trust by the state. They
Yes.
do not belong to the state.
No, it is held in trust, and of course one of the trust purposes is for the benefit of Native Hawaiians.
Lands are held in trust by the state. They do
Yes.
not belong to the state. Do not belong to the state.
No, it is held in trust, and of course one of the trust purposes is for the benefit of Native Hawaiians.
How would you like to have, Doc, 1.8 million acres of land in Hawaii today? How would you like to have 200,000 acres in additional land reserved for Hawaiians by congressional act?
I'm always open to negotiation.
Yeah, that's right. So when we come down to it, when you get right down to the nitty-gritties of all of this, this has nothing to do with the Constitution. This has nothing to do with race. This has to do with assets, land and money.
Let's see, the gentle lady from California is here first. Ms. Palatano, do you have questions?
Yes, I have one, Mr. Chair. Very interesting to hear your testimony, Ms. Hirona. I never really discussed Hawaii's interest, but I'm glad to hear that this is on the table. One of the things that comes to mind is in the instance of territories, there are benefits that those territories receive. Now, in Hawaii's instance, what kind of resource or extending services would be established to benefit the Native Hawaiians if this bill passes?
This bill sets up a process whereby the United States can recognize a constituted Native Hawaiian governing entity. It creates a process. There are a lot of obviously, this is the beginning of, the passage of this bill would be the beginning of that process, but various kinds of other issues that would relate to the kinds of things you're talking about would require the Department of Interior, the state of Hawaii to enter into negotiations on those kinds of specifics that I believe you're asking. So
But
it's
what-
not as though by creating this, by passing this bill, that all of a sudden there is going to be all of these changes that are made without any involvement by anyone else.
When that brings the next question, have these agencies not been providing the proper assistance to a qualified state, Hawaii?
The Congress has passed over 150 laws that relate to Native Hawaiians, and so in that sense, there have been established any number of programs that support Native Hawaiians. It is, but what has been missing is an acknowledgement of a Native Hawaiian governing entity, a government-to-government relationship that the Alaska Natives and the American Indian tribes have with the United States.
And specifically, that is? Specifically, what does that allow them to be in that recognition?
Alaska Natives and American Indians have a nation-to-nation relationship.
Okay.
And I'm not familiar with all of the specifics of the kind of legislation that applies to these entities, but the thing that we should remember is that the United States has a special relationship with Native peoples. And Native Hawaiians are Native peoples. They are the only remaining Native peoples of this country that has not attained this kind of recognition and relationship with the U.S. government. And that is what this bill is seeking to foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That answers the question.
Gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Loomis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's such a pleasure to see you here this morning, Representative Hirono. I do have some questions for you. I have read in press reports that most Hawaiians oppose this legislation. Do you believe that's a correct statement, and do you have information to the contrary or that would support that?
That is not an accurate reflection of the support that this legislation of the Native Hawaiians have in Hawaii. The poll that you're referring to was a push poll, and the way the question was asked, I would say most people would say that they would not support it,
Okay.
that they would not support it,
Okay.
that they would not support it.
Okay. Now, I understand there may be as many as 400,000 people that are eligible to be part of the governmental entity that would come out of this bill. How would they relate to the Hawaiian government that was set up when Hawaii became a state, and the United States government and other entities that are already existing, such as city and county government?
This bill establishes a process whereby the Native Hawaiians will be enrolled as a part of the group that will participate in discussions about what a government entity should look like. But as I mentioned, the Native Hawaiians cannot on their own, by themselves, without any input or any kind of negotiation with the state of Hawaii, as well as with the United States Congress, in fact, and the U.S. Department of Interior, as to the specific governing documents. This is a bill that creates a process whereby all of those kinds of elements of what a governing structure should look like can proceed. But what that all will be in finality remains for all of the kind of input and agreement from other entities.
And is that also true such as whether or not Native Hawaiians would still be required to pay state income and excise taxes, Those issues seem to be unaddressed in this bill. So is that up in the air?
All of those kinds of issues,